Yes, so
So
go
I
on.
think it depends on how much abstraction it covers. Yes, everybody acts on some premise, I think, because I would say, like, even attempting to reason, I think people all function with thinking. So it's going to use some amount of logic, I think, and always some amount of concepts too. Because I think you literally wouldn't function if you had no concepts or anything. It's just how well integrated they are. I think if you've integrated a lot, you can say you've acted on a principle or using a principle. Right or wrong, it's still a principle. But if you're just acting like, oh, I just want I just want chocolate ice cream today and just act on that, then maybe you could say my principle is seek what gives me pleasure, and in that sense, you could call that a um, a principle because that's a means of behavior that they use almost as a rule or as a way to integrate many types of actions into one. So it depends on the type of action you're talking about and the reasoning they give.
Yeah, so that's what I have trouble with. I agree with you that to me, the way I understand principle is that it's explicitly held and it's an abstraction and it
Yeah.
is in some way fundamental and guides action. But someone like throwing a microphone on the floor in rage because it doesn't work, or someone just going, oh, I feel like ice cream out of the blue. Let me go grab some ice cream and eating it is not, that's not, I don't see a principle there. But what about the claim that, because this is what I read today, why should one act on principle? And I'm just reading about like philosophy and life in general. What about the idea that by taking those actions or habits, they amount to implicit principles? So like, if I throw the microphone on the floor in a rage, the implicit principle is that it's like stamping my foot at reality for not behaving in the way I wanted to, which is,
Yes.
I got that from Brandon, that wording. Um, so what are your thoughts on that? Like,
On
I'm
an
just trying to get my
implicit,
head around explicit and implicit principle
okay,
and like,
implicit, I would say yes, that
okay,
there would be always an implicit principle, not in the sense that they see the principle at all,
yeah,
not from their perspective, but that if I looked at their behaviors and I tried to integrate them and found something in common among all these behaviors, if I found an
right,
underlying motive to many of their actions, I could
right,
then say, oh, pleasure is their principle. They might not see it, they might just notice, I want ice cream now, or I want a car, or I want just whatever they immediately feel. They might not even recognize it as a principle and they're just going off that intuition or just the emotion. But if we integrate it from the outside, we can see that we look at their behavior, we integrate what we've observed about their behavior. You might be able to say they're probably acting on a principle of hedonism. That based on the way they've made their choices, it seems like their principle is there. They just haven't recognized it. Or the material is there to make a principle, but they haven't done the work to integrate it. Like clearly the referent is there, but they just haven't done the work.
right. And then the guy who smashes the mouse or stamps or smashes the microphone because it doesn't work, is the implicit principle, um, there is no objective reality and um, reality is subjective because you're
That's
angry that it's your reality has not uh, uh, reality is not behaving as you want it to, and that's an injustice because it's a subjective reality and now it's doing injustice against you.
it's always hard to infer what somebody would be thinking there. I'm not sure there is enough information to say that it's because reality makes them upset or that they
Okay,
wish reality were otherwise.
right.
We could say implicitly they were acting on a premise like that, but is that what they're thinking? Well, you do need to take into account what they might be using to think about, because we would want to take into consideration what type of actions are they trying.
Usually it's not thought. I remember when I was a kid and I got a video game. Someone bought me a video game. It was on a CD and it used some kind of new graphics engine that my PC didn't support. And I tried to keep play it and start it up and it wouldn't work. And it, just in a rage, I smashed the CD in half. But I wouldn't have words to tell you. Like, I was just angry. And this is ages ago. This is when I was a kid. And that's what I was thinking of. But in that case, like, is that not, you know, like you could look at it from multiple perspectives. You could say, oh, a psychologist might tell you, oh, it's the accumulation of upsets in life and they've all just, things have not gone well. And then he's just expressed the upset in one thing, you know, like when, what is it, that psychoanalysis 101, whatever is impressed is eventually expressed in some way. So you accumulate all these angers and they're an outburst. But like a philosophical perspective might tell you, this is what I want to know what you think about, might tell you, oh, okay, that's the implicit. He's acting on the implicit premise that reality should bend to his will and that the universe is subjective, not objective and independent of consciousness. Something like that. What are your thoughts?
Usually I would need more information. Depends on the person. Some people I do know enough about them that I feel like I can make a fair judgment. Like if I studied somebody a lot about their biography, I might be able to. If I just saw somebody yelling, like I walked into a store and I saw somebody yelling at a waiter because their food was cold, like I'm not going to go judge because they rely on social metaphysics and they use their
No, I'm not saying
social.
that though. I'm not, that's the next question. This is the question right now is simply on that specific action. I'm not saying that's what they
Okay.
are in
I would
total. I'm just,
say I need more information. I'd say I don't know. Maybe there's some possibilities, but it's just speculation and I don't have much to go on. And I would then, if I want to figure out what is their motivators in life, I might, well, one, I mean, have they done that before? What is it that they're upset about? Or what's their home life like? And I would wonder about those things right away. I
right,
wouldn't jump right into their implicit principle because they're not anywhere near enough information. I think you would need a lot of time to really judge that. But you can
right,
say that, oh, there, I know some reasons this can happen. Almost like a doctor would. Like you can say somebody has a fever. Well, there's many reasons there's a fever. You know, there's some things you rule out completely. Like a fever wouldn't just be because you bumped your shin on something. But then you might wonder, like, well, is it a disease or maybe you opened a wound and it got infected or something? Like, I mean, there's certain things you would know to look for next to try to see what is the problem, like to diagnose it. You would know where to go next.
so in the case of, let's say you're in an office and uh, it's a office, I don't know, it's finance, whatever, it's a accounting firm. And some guy is sitting next to you and he goes, fuck this. He just starts smashing the mouse and just throws it behind him. What would you say then? Like without, you don't know him. What would you say as far as the premise he was acting on? Like what,
Well, I
to smash the
you
mouse?
go, what's so upsetting and why does it
Right,
matter so much?
right,
That would be like my first thought. Like what could be worth getting that upset over? I mean, I would have to ask what is it first, and they might tell me. Then I might think it's ridiculous, but then to really act as like a, if I really wanted to figure it out, I would just start acting like a therapist. Like, oh, why are you upset today? Like, is everything okay at home or things like that? I might ask if I really wanted to know. Most of the time, I would just let it go. But if I wanted to find out and diagnose it, that's the process I would go through.
yeah. I mean, that makes sense to me. I, I guess I was just thinking now, well, you know, if, it depends if someone expresses anger and they do it by smashing something, it would matter if the anger is about something that someone else did or the anger is about the mouse isn't working. They're different angers, right? Like
Yeah.
one is about just the universe in general, maybe. And the other one is, well, you're angry at a mouse or you're angry at a
Yeah.
computer, which doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
I'm
And
trying
if
to
it was just, if they were just angry at the computer for not loading
working.
fast enough, that might be
Yeah.
like you, I don't have that many explanations other than, I mean, I would still check about them, but that would drastically reduce my amount of possibilities I think it could be. Like I wouldn't start wondering, oh, it's because there's some things that wouldn't be worth guessing. But it's like I think like any kind of diagnosis, there's a lot of uncertainty. You just have to ask questions and you can find out.
I'm actually more curious about in ourselves, but I'm trying to find an
In
example
ourselves.
right now from Brent, the book I was just reading. Let's see if I can get it. Okay, here, I've got it. Maybe I can share screen and then we can discuss it. There's a couple. Okay, and I'll put it in the why act on principle thing, but it's unrelated. So let me set up the share screen. Okay. See it?
Yep.
Okay. Here they go. This is multiple paragraphs, but I've kind of just pasted it all. This is what they're saying, and this is why I'm asking you the question, because I was curious about this. They're saying that the meaning and consequence of reacting to the frustration by the policy of sulking, whining, complaining, and feeling sorry for oneself rather than reacting by thinking. Well, I think that they do give it context, because on its own, I wouldn't agree with that. But reality has the implicit meaning. So this is what I'm interested about. Is there implicit meanings or principles in things we think or do? Implicit meaning of such a fit attitude is reality has let me down. It should have given me what I wanted. It should have permitted me my desires, which means reality should have been what I wanted it to be. Because what I wanted, it should have adapted itself to my emotions. Something like that.
I think the difference here in interpretation might be, well, why is it consequences of reacting to frustrations by the policy of sulking, blah, blah, blah. I think when you phrase it as a policy of doing that, then that's different. Like supposing a person reacts to their frustrations through a policy of sulking, like it's the routine way of dealing with things. But you're making the assumption in this case that take a person who does that. Like we're not wondering if do people do that? No. Just take the example of somebody doing that. And I think I would agree that if that's your policy, then the attitude is implicitly something like reality should give me what I want. And I get mad when it doesn't, because the anger is like forcing things to be a certain way. Reality won't let it be that way, so I'm going to lash out just to force it to be so. And I think that could be like a policy of if you're sulking all the time, it's like, I think often it will be and it needs to be that way, it has to be that way. And if it doesn't conform to my wish, I will lash out. But the hard part is like, why lash out? But I can imagine sometimes people doing that out of self-hatred, perhaps. Like you might say reality is, I can never get, reality always fails me. Or I say reality is what it is and I fail as a person. Therefore, I'm angry at myself. It could go that way too.
Say that again, sorry. Reality is?
Like almost saying you wish you could act in a way that conforms with reality, but you can't. You see yourself as a failure.
Right.
That wouldn't be so much that reality has to be what I want it to be, but that I failed to live up to reality. I failed to meet any standards that reality requires me to live. Like I failed to be rational. I'm no good. I'm terrible. So I'll get angry because I know I'm failing. And but I mean, that's not that many possibilities here. It's not like I'm saying it could be anything. Well, there's a few things I think it could be. Like if Fran thinks it's one, okay, I'm saying there's probably 3 examples.
This is Brandon.
Oh, Brandon, like I'll say this. Okay, you can think of one example. I can think of more. I mean, it's not a
Yeah.
huge deal. I mean, it's not like I'm saying, well, there's 50 other possibilities. Like, no, I'm saying there's just a few more. So maybe Brandon should have considered more, but it's not like some drastic failure of reasoning here. I mean, I think we can think about it more. We could come up with a couple more examples of what it
And
might mean implicitly.
this is the example they give. So two people arguing, and then at the height of the quarrel, one rushes furiously out of the room, usually up a flight of stairs. What is it that she thinks changes by her running away? This is what I was interested. Isn't the philosophical meaning of her action, what is it? If she isn't there to face the problem, it will somehow dissolve in accordance with her desires, that she doesn't have to deal with it or even acknowledge its reality. Although, of course, a statement of philosophical subjectivism is scarcely a conscious intention. Like, we're putting aside she comes back and apologizes
Okay.
and all of that, because that would be
Yeah.
recognition. We're just saying she's just stormed off. Like,
Yeah.
is that, would you agree with that?
Isn't there to face the problem?
And I agree, if that's a constant thing, yes. But
Yeah.
what about if it's one? Does it have its own individual meaning?
Could it? I'm thinking. No, I don't think it even implies that. I mean, it doesn't mean you run away. You're not there to face the problem. It's more like now isn't the time to face the problem. It's not like you're evading it. It's just sometimes there's a better time. Like, I don't know, 10 minutes
I
later.
agree with that too. But I looked at the rush, like, what was it? The kind of dramatic just exit, which I've experienced before. Like, someone at the height of an argument just goes, fine, and just leaves or whatever.
Then I
That would
think,
be kind of,
then I would start to think, well, that isn't just like, oh, I'll think about it later. It probably is something like, or like playing games with you, like manipulating you. It's either manipulation or refusing to face the problem. I guess manipulation could be, or maybe she sees the problem. It's just she wants to manipulate it to end up how she wants anyway. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that's just,
right.
but then
Right,
that
right,
gets
right.
difficult because
No, I agree with
if
you.
you,
There's multiple ways to interpret it. In this case, I guess they're giving that as, because you're right. There's probably different ways to interpret it. Um, maybe there's manipulation, maybe it's some of this. I wouldn't know how to, that varies from person to person. But I mean, even if it's the case of someone manipulating, is there an underlying philosophical meaning or premise to the
yeah,
action?
that's what I was,
That's really what I'm interested in.
I was just thinking, well, maybe that could imply a degree of not wanting to face the problem, as in you manipulate it, as in you don't want to face the problem as it is. You're not trying to solve the problem. You're just avoiding it, evading it to get some other end about it. Like if you're manipulating somebody, it's not because I would almost think that manipulation itself would mean that you're not trying to solve a problem. You're just trying to get something to be a certain way.
Right.
Um, it's not about solving. It's just about forcing the matter or something like that. It's not a matter of, say, reasoning a problem out. It's more of a policy of um, emotional outrage in a sense. If you're just using emotional outrage, it's not reason. We could even say that it's an avoidance of desire,
Right.
or
It's
an
not
avoidance of,
communication. Right. It's not
yeah,
even communication by reason, right? It's like,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And then the problem dissolves, and then it just ends up as she wished. The result of the manipulation, like say, oh, you conceded and you said, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I made you upset. I won't do it again. Even though she's the one who did something terrible.
So then you can stamp your foot at reality, is the belief.
Yeah, I mean, if we really analyze it there, we could find that belief, but it really depends on this information that you're saying. They literally stomp away or they throw up their hands and say fine and walk away. That gives you reason to start thinking, well, yeah, we can start thinking about what's the underlying premise here because we're trying to think of different motivations here
I like
of why to act a certain way or what it accomplishes, or even what their stated goal is.
I like the word premise more than belief, because belief would imply, imply or connote conscious thought, whereas this could just be, if we're just talking about the one action, almost in
Yes.
isolation. If
Yeah,
you
it could
can
just
do
be
that, I think.
subconscious, even a
Right.
subconscious thing. Yeah.
Okay. So, we've got that. We're saying then that yes, you can. Every action might have an implicit principle that includes it. Would that be correct? Like, even for example, the way I'm just trying to think, does everything include a principle? Like the way I stand or whatever. Some kind of view of, because according to philosophy, that seems to be what's claimed, is that everything implies some philosophical principle. And so
Well,
if I sit like this with my hand on my chin, is that what's the philosophical principle in play?
I would say that a principle. I mean, there are always actions are always could be part of any principle, like, or not any principle, but principles always have associated actions. Like, there's
Right.
no action isolated from a principle. Like, no, I don't know how to phrase this. Um,
Well, I know what you mean.
Action,
Principles are abstract, so they include a lot of different things.
yeah,
And
like the
fundamental
actions.
principles, philosophical principles, apparently include everything.
Actions can always be included within some principle.
Right.
It doesn't mean they're acting with regard to it, but that if we took a principle, that action can fit into
Right.
some action will always fit in there, and
Right.
some action will always match to some principle, but
Right.
maybe more than one principle. So that's really what I'm saying. Like, an action could have many principles, but a principle only has certain actions that fit with it.
But then, does that mean are philosophical principles so fundamental that they encompass or include all action? And if so, does that not mean that every action thought has implicit uh, philosophical principles, implied philosophical principles involved?
Um, Implicitly, I think there will always be some associated principle. Like, if you took
Right?
all the in the world, and then you took all the possible actions in the world, there's like,
Do
just
they
imagine
all?
all the principles in the world. Um,
Let's just
every
stay with
action will involve,
philosophical principles. Yeah.
okay, every philosophical principle, or take every possible philosophical principle, and then take every possible action. Like, every action will fit into some principle.
Okay.
And that's the best way I think I could put it. So you'll never
Got
find
it.
an action that has no implicit principle.
Right.
That's what I mean.
So then, does that mean, like, at what point? I don't know if I like that wording, because but I'm curious then, like, when something does become a policy, because if we're saying that all actions imply a certain philosophical principle, whether someone is consciously aware of it or not, how what is the relationship between the habituation of those actions and when they become, like, when that philosophy becomes their policy, basically, is what I'm, because this is what I was interested in, because I was still kind of vague on, like, does philosophy always have to affect my life or not? Do principles always affect my life or not? And then I was thinking, like, well, after reading some of these articles, like, okay, if I break the CD or if I throw the microphone on the floor, um, when can I say that I am a whim worshipper, or when can I say that I am I believe in a subjective reality and stamp my foot at reality? Because obviously, when we speak of philosophical principles, if they're wrong, they're never going to be consistently practiced. Just like in this article, you know, like to be a killer, you cannot kill 99.9% of the time, but if you kill the rest of the time, you're still a killer. So isn't it the same with some philosophical principles? And then when do we say that they become, like, how do we work out when it's a policy?
Mm,
Does my question make sense?
yeah, I think it. I mean, clearly with the killing example, I mean, I guess it depends on the concept because by nature, people usually refer to that. If you do it once, you will always fit that category.
Right.
If you fit the category killer, if you do it once,
Right.
you could say you're not a professional killer, or you could say you did it once, but the severity of it doesn't change. You could say I cooked a hamburger once. It doesn't mean you're a cook per se, but
Yes.
because people mean they usually refer you do it a lot. And so when you say policy, you're just saying you do this a lot. I mean, what is
Right.
the threshold when it becomes a lot? I guess it could depend on what type of action. Like,
Right. You're right. Yeah, it's
sulking.
context. Yeah, it's context dependent. I learned that from that. You're totally right. Yeah, like murderer is the context is different from, say, checking your phone or something. So yeah.
Yeah, a whim worshiper. That means that I think you need a lot of time of doing that. Like, I don't know, over a couple of years, you seem to notice almost every day you do it. Then it's like, yeah, you probably are. If you notice it every day, then for
Right.
a year, then you probably are. If you only
Right.
saw it once, and it's like maybe you acted on it um, implicitly, that would have implied a principle of. Well, it gets tricky to say principle there because if you do it once in contradiction to what you usually do, but still, the idea being here that um,
Well, contradiction is fine because, like, as in, if you're acting on a principle, because if it's a principle that is contradictory and impossible to practice, then you can't, unless you kill yourself, basically. You can't act on it
yeah,
fully. So you're going to be contradictory. And then it just becomes a question
yeah,
of how much of it, what kind of actions do you need to take before you, yeah,
yeah.
okay.
I mean,
So,
if you only did it once, it wouldn't be a policy, really.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Hmm. Okay.
but to
So
say,
then,
does it, what, if you do it once, I think even doing it once doesn't necessarily imply you're acting on an implicit principle. Because, I mean, if somebody threw up their hands once and said, like, fine, you're right, and just tried to manipulate one time, would we say that's an implicit policy or an implicit, like, in that? But
I would say that it depends on what they do after. Do they correct and apologize and then try and negotiate? Or do they
I think
become,
that
because they
makes
will become
sense.
aware of it, then go, no, I'm waiting for this person to come back to me or something like that.
I think that makes sense. But you could still associate with some principle, or it can, if it were to become something you do all the time, it would fit a certain principle. So you say it's that you're acting like somebody who, um, when we're, or acting like somebody has a policy of getting mad at reality for not conforming to their desires. You say that's why you want to avoid acting like that in the future, because if you did it all the time, that would imply that policy.
Um, do you think that, uh, like, okay, so I'm seeing how we can take actions and, like, someone by habit is acting according to certain philosophical principles or philosophic principles. Um, but you wouldn't say they have, like, you wouldn't say they have a philosophy if they haven't thought about it still, right? Like, you
Right.
wouldn't, maybe there's a worldview and it's an emotional worldview, but can you still call that, like, that's their philosophy? I'm just trying to get my head around this argument about everyone has a philosophy, everyone needs a philosophy, that kind of thing. You wouldn't say, you'd say they're almost pre-philosophy. They're just kind
Yeah,
of like
I would
acting
agree.
on, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, I don't say it's like not there, but it's more like non-philosophy. It's more like, I mean, just say, I mean, atheism is still a belief about theology, I guess you could say. It doesn't mean you're not, you have no beliefs about religion. It doesn't, I don't know if that's a good example. Just to say you're not thinking in a coherent way doesn't mean it isn't any kind of philosophy. It's almost like a non-philosophy. It's a philosophy of emotionalism, the philosophy of non-reason.
Oh, so you're saying it is even if someone's not consciously explicit about it, you're saying it is a philosophy.
It's, I don't really like that wording. I mean, it's not a philosophy in the sense of being a worldview. It's a hodgepodge of things. If you just
Does
get an
the
ad hoc combination, is it really a philosophy?
does the hodgepodge integrate? Like, in the same way that we say someone is a killer when they kill 0.01% of the time, does someone become of a certain kind of philosophy when they act, in a similar, like there's a different way of judging, right? It's not consistency, because consistency might be death. It's some similar measurement.
I would say yes, everybody would have some. I don't think anybody can even function existing unless their mind even does it automatically sometimes. I don't
Right.
think your mind would even function in a way that doesn't just happen automatically. Yeah, it's not integrated, but I don't think your mind literally can function without integrating. Some of the time it just does it. You don't even necessarily will it to happen. It just kind of happens, and not in an integrated way, but just that, like sort of that first level concept thing we talk about. Like you have a first level concept of like the color green. You aren't really conscious of that. That was not really a volitional process per se. So it could be these very primitive ways of thinking. That's not really volitional. It's more like that first level concept that just kind of happens automatically before you realize the process you're going through. So it would be very primitive and almost pre-philosophy, as you say, because you're not using your reason. You're just going at these very basic function. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then it would fall under an implicit philosophy of emotionalism, but
Yeah.
it's not explicitly held, but it's still effectively acting on it.
Yeah, but it's so
And
primitive. It's like they never used reason. They never used
right,
volitional confirmation. It's just they began at the first level and that was it. They stopped there,
do
which
you?
would be terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what we're talking about, but I agree with that. With like, if you're talking about a primitive tribe, it would be you could say in one sense they have pre-philosophy, and in another sense, from a different perspective, you could say they're emotionalists or whatever, but it's still
Yes.
pre-philosophy. Um, do you think habits are generalizations?
Not always.
Not always. Okay.
Habits
Uh,
being like,
do you
well, what
do you
kind?
think?
Give me an example.
Well, what I was curious about is, do we generalize from habits? Because I was reading like, oh, we always we're generalization machines. I'm trying to concretize that more. For example, if I do tend to, when I get angry, smash stuff, does my subconscious generalize from that? Is that like, is there some generalization that my subconscious takes from those actions that amounts to something? Or like, are they just disconnected? uh yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
just, well,
I
I
just want a
guess
better
if,
example of what an example of a habit. I want to make sure I'm
okay,
thinking about this correctly.
smashing things when they don't work, or getting really angry, like if a plate
Okay,
drops and then getting
got
really
it.
angry, or like, and kicking something, or if my microphone doesn't work, throwing it on the floor. Like, actually, I think I answered my own question, because if that becomes a habit, like that all of those together become a habit, getting angry when things don't work your way, and they turn into actions like kicking or feeling a certain way, and we're saying that all actions imply a philosophical principle, then we are saying that they do generalize in some way, right?
I think so because you're saying it's a response to a general response to some category of actions or some category of events.
Yeah.
So, like, if you're, I think by definition, it has to be a generalization because you're responding to the same way to a wider category of events. It's not just anymore like, oh, you stepped on the Lego and you got upset and cursed, and and got really upset. She's like, you're doing that to anything that didn't go right.
Right.
That would be a generalization, like stepping on Legos, stubbing your toe. And I mean, you would generalize to some extent. So yeah, I think there's habit is some kind of generalization.
Right.
Whether or not it's always volitional is another question. I mean, I would say that certain very basic ones we might say, like in terms of the same way we say that forming the concept green is somewhat non-volitional. Forming some habits are generally non-volitional. It might be different if a habit of, say, responding to communists in a certain way, like because it probably has to do with the way you've integrated your evaluation of communists, and you've had to think explicitly what is a communist and what kind of concept is that, or what does it mean to believe in communism, and all those sort of things. That's different than you get mad when somebody looked at you the wrong way. I mean, it's a different kind of evaluation there.
Yeah. Okay. Can you prove to me that I can't help but be influenced by philosophy? This is something that I'm really fascinated by this argument, and I see some of it, but to be honest, it's still not clear to me. Like I want it to be true, but then that's not enough. Like I want proof. I want to, like, where I like, it's hard for me to pinpoint in my, that's not true, because I read Rand's fiction and that definitely carried me in a certain direction. But like I want more, I want it to feel more real, because I'm not really sure that I can, like, I want more examples of how can I escape it? Like, can you show me that I can't help but be influenced by it? Are there any thoughts that come to mind? You don't know, if you don't know, that's fine. But I just wondered if you had any.
Can't help it.
Yeah, like it's always, how am I, like, is it possible for me to avoid it?
Can you avoid philosophy? I'm not sure it's possible. Just based on what I know about how the human mind functions, I don't think anybody can get away from trying to have a viewpoint or even attempting to make something coherent in their mind of any variety of person, no matter how irrational or rational. I think that will always be present in all people. It's almost like an aspect of being a rational animal. I mean, it's not essential that I think everybody can't help but having at least subconscious beliefs. I don't think
Okay.
anybody, that's like a non-essential fact, but I think that applies nonetheless to basically all people in the same way. They all have thumbs.
All right. Well, let me say I'm a doctor, and I've been to school, and all that philosophy crap doesn't interest me. I want to live my life and forget it. This is going back to this example. Now, all this stuff about beliefs, like, can't I, I have, beliefs about hot tea is, I enjoy hot tea, but that has nothing to do with philosophy. So why are you saying that, we have subconscious beliefs, therefore we need philosophy? I have tons of beliefs that don't have anything to do with philosophy. Like, I know that if my patient is sick, I need to do something for him. I know that
well,
I know
it's more
how to
like,
do it because of medical science. I wouldn't say medical science is philosophy, but we learned through medical science, not through philosophy. And so a lot of my beliefs are based in medical science. And so how is it then I can't avoid, like, I've avoided philosophy all my life?
I would say they haven't. I would say it's the subconscious integration. I don't mean anything mystical about that. I just mean that there are things your mind can do automatically to put patterns together and pattern match that aren't necessarily volitionally directed. And I don't think anybody doesn't do that. I think that's always going on in some way. And I think for that to occur in the human way, I think they'll always be applying some kind of philosophy or way of putting it all together, a general approach of, well, then it gets tough because how exactly do we define philosophy? It's like, I just think of it as the most general abstraction, the field of all.
I think that's the issue there as well. It feels a bit, yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't, like, I know some of what you're saying, but I'm still not, even having studied some of this now, I'm still not clear on it. But I imagine, as someone who doesn't have any exposure, like you said, it's the widest abstraction, subconscious integrations. They would just go, oh, more of this bullshit.
Yeah.
Fuck.
What is the
This is a load of
everyday,
crap.
the layman's definition? That so their eyes won't glaze over. I mean, that seems a more important way to think about it.
Yeah, I agree.
What is philosophy besides just debates about these little questions? I mean, some people really get into, well, philosophy is stupid. It's just these little pointless debates that really have no bearing on anything in the way society develops. So who
Yeah.
cares? Science reigns supreme, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. I sympathize with that. I think that's, no,
I can
I get,
sympathize with it,
I get it.
but the hard part is usually the common answer is be like, well, whatever your approach to science is, that too is philosophy.
Well,
That's
see,
epistemology.
I mean, that's what I read, but to know it and be able to point
Okay.
to lots of examples is what I find difficult. Like if I, for example, let's say I was speaking to this doctor, which this was a real conversation. I was like, well, you believe this and this and this, and they were based in this philosophy. And that would be one thing versus,
Yeah.
you know, it's pretty, anyway, it's a difficult conversation. I was just curious. And it wasn't just for the purposes of conversation. Obviously it's clarifying it in my head too, because it's not, like,
Right.
it sounds good, but I'm not fully, like, it's not like the truck.
Yes.